Hi everyone. I, 28 female, am at a complete loss on what to do regarding my relationship with my dad. It is quite complex and needs lots of context. My parents got married but split up just before I was born, finalizing their divorce a few months later. Unfortunately, my dad chose not to be a part of my life from the very beginning. You see, my dad was a serial cheater and a drunkard. They had gotten married young because they were together throughout college, and my dad had proposed to my mom, thinking this is what he wanted. However, I guess people change and so do their feelings because 2 years into his marriage, my mom found out that he had been hanging out with his ex-girlfriend Kylie, who he used to date back in high school. They had reconnected and she seemed hung up on him. My mom has told me how Kylie would show up to the house demanding to meet my dad if he did not pick up her calls. She would insist on having dinner with him and be overall quite disrespectful to my mom and my parents' marriage. Whenever Dad and Kylie would meet up, they would drink a lot, which would then prevent Dad from coming back home. Kylie would insist on him walking her back to her house. My mom would tell me how Dad would show up the next morning still hungover, and if Mom asked him about why he was out the entire night, they would have a screaming match. It was not like my dad was only spending his nights with Kylie. There were other random girls he would hook up with from the bar, but Kylie seemed to be a constant. My dad can be quite hurtful with his words. He would constantly tell my mother how pathetic she was and how other women were so much prettier than her. He would also throw things at her if she ever asked him to stay away from Kylie. This went on for 2 years because my mother was a love-struck fool for my dad and thought he would somehow go back to who he was back in their college days. One day, Kylie sent an inappropriate message to my mom from my dad's phone with a message saying, "He is not yours." My mother had enough and packed her bags to go and live with her parents, my grandparents. However, my grandfather did not like this decision. He would taunt my mother for abandoning her husband and not being a good wife. He was vehemently against my mother seeking divorce because, according to him, people should stick to their marriage even if it is hard. My grandma was the only one who supported her. My mom knew that she needed to find a job and move out. However, during this time, my mom found out that she was pregnant with me. My mom has told me that she never even once thought about not having me because she had always wanted to be a mother. When she informed my dad about the news, he was shocked, but he was pleased as well. My dad begged my mother to come back home to him and told her how he would give up drinking. My grandfather encouraged my mother to go back to him since, according to him, it was the right thing to do. My mother begrudgingly agreed as she had no other option at that time. My dad did give up drinking and hooking up with other women during that time. He worked hard to buy all the baby stuff for me, and my mom was happy. Kylie never showed up ever again, and my mom slowly started to forgive my dad for their past. I was born as a healthy baby, and my mom has told me how everyone was so happy when I was born. For a while, everything seemed to be going well, or so my mom thought, until a woman turned up at my parents' place with a pregnant belly. Apparently, my dad had slept with a stranger once during my mom's pregnancy, and that woman had tracked my dad down. She demanded my dad pay child support, and my dad lost his mind since being the coward that he is. He didn't want to take responsibility. My mother also wanted nothing to do with him anymore. She informed him that she wanted a divorce. She packed her bags and took me to live with her parents. My grandfather did try to put up a fight, but my grandma decided to put her foot down. She threatened to kick him out since it was technically her house, which she got from her parents' inheritance, and my grandfather shut up after that. Although he was resentful that my mother had walked away from her marriage and was worried about what his church friends would say. He helped my mom take care of me in whatever way he could. My mother filed for divorce, and the court was not in my father's favor, thankfully. He was mandated to pay child support until I turned 18, and the other woman did the same. My dad, being the resentful a-hole he is, decided to hurt my mother by saying that he wanted nothing to do with me and gave up full custody. My mother was hurt, but she knew it was better that I didn't grow up anywhere around him. I grew up with my mother and grandparents, and I never even knew having a father was normal. It was only when my friends started to tease me about it that I started to question my mother. She would always change the subject and tell me how I was too young to understand. My grandmother would tell me the same thing. It was only my grandfather who was honest with me. He told me that I had every right to know where my father was and showed me pictures of him and his mom. In the pictures, my parents looked so happy. I could finally understand where my curly hair and green eyes came from, since my mother and her side of the family all had straight hair and brown eyes. I felt curious to know more about my dad. As I started to grow up, I found more and more about him. I decided to write letters to him and would beg my mother to mail it to him, even though she would refuse. I would then seek help from my grandfather, who would begrudgingly agree. I wrote several letters to my dad, but never received a reply back. When I was 12 years old, a week before my birthday, I decided to confront my dad. We lived in a small town, and I knew the neighborhood he lived in. Even though I didn't know which was his house, I cycled to each and every house around the locality, asking around for him. In the end, one of his helpful neighbors pointed out his house to me. I was so nervous to ring his doorbell, but I gathered up my courage and thought that he would be happy to see me finally. I wanted to show him that he was still my dad, no matter what. When he opened the door, he looked like he had been drinking since last night. He stared at me for a few minutes before his eyes widened and he realized who I was. He immediately looked around and asked what the hell I was doing. My face fell, and I told him timidly that I was here to meet him. I told him how I was going to be 13 soon and wanted to invite him to my birthday party. I told him that none of my friends believed I had a dad and I wanted him to attend my party. He looked shocked and told me to wait outside for a few seconds. He went inside and got his car keys and then put my cycle on his back seat and asked me to get in. Throughout the drive, he looked pissed and I felt like I had made a grave mistake. He didn't utter a single word, and when we reached my home, he yelled at my mother to come out. My mother ran outside, and when she saw me standing next to him, she asked me if I was okay. My grandparents looked taken aback, seeing my dad also. My dad continued to berate my mother for allowing me to go and see him and told her how I don't want to see your child ever in front of my face. I felt numb with pain and hurt as he continued to yell about how he didn't sign up for this and hated seeing how similar I looked to him. He then drove away as if I meant nothing. I still remember the tears falling down my face. It felt like someone had kicked me in my stomach, and the pain was everywhere. My mother just hugged me and kept crying. My grandparents brought us inside, and even my grandfather broke down. He started to tell my mother how this was all his fault and that he should never have told me the truth, but the damage was done. I was numb for days and felt too sick to go to school. My grandfather would stay awake throughout the night for me since he blamed himself throughout all of this. When I started to get better, he told me how I needed to forget my piece of shit father and that he was going to give me everything I ever needed. But I have to admit that my dad's rejection deeply affected me. I couldn't comprehend why he didn't want any connection with me, and it led me to internalize negative beliefs about myself. I began to think I was flawed, worthless, even a bad person. These thoughts deeply affected my self-esteem at that age and made it challenging for me to build healthy relationships with anyone. However, my grandfather did everything that he could to replace the role of my father in my life. He would show up to pick me up from school and would make sure that none of my friends ever bullied me again by talking to their parents about their behavior. He also taught me to hunt and change attire, telling me how I needed to be independent on my own. He would tell me how he never taught my mother all this because he grew up in different times, but after watching my father humiliate me, he did not want me to ever end up in a situation like this. I grew up and slowly started realizing that not everyone was like my dad. I realized I was surrounded by my mother and grandparents who loved me so much, and that was enough for me. When I turned 18 and started applying for colleges, I knew my grandparents were sad that I would be leaving them. I was sad too, but my mother encouraged me to apply to the best colleges and talked about how I was not meant to be a small town girl. I got into a good university with a full scholarship and moved out. Everything was so different living in a big city, and it took me a long time to get adjusted. I would call home crying because I was surrounded by strangers and new faces, and all my feelings of past abandonment and rejection kept resurfacing. And this is when I met Jack in my college. He was just like me, who had come from a small town and didn't have any friends either. We started to hang out and realized how similar-minded we were. Both of us were thirsty to be successful and make a name for ourselves. We would spend day and night cooped up in the library, studying or memorizing something. As you can imagine, this is how we fell in love. We adored each other's intelligence, and we still do. When we graduated, Jack and I moved in together. During Christmas, we brought our families to meet each other. To our surprise, Jack's parents and my mother blended well. My grandparents were very proud that I had managed to secure a job straight out of college, and during this time my mother did have a talk with me and let me know that even though she loved Jack and knew that he was a good guy, she still didn't want me to retain my financial independence. She reminded me how Dad had abused her and gently told me that she believed I could take care of myself, but I should always have my own bank account with my emergency fund just in case. I understood where my mom was coming from, luckily for me. Jack was nothing like my dad. We had our separate bank accounts and split rent and bills equally. We were clear from the beginning that we didn't want children, as both of us had childhood traumas, and we didn't want to pass it on to our kids. I know a lot of people will say that what our parents do has nothing to do with us, but Jack and I just didn't want kids. We were happy on our own from the beginning and were too career-focused. Then in August 2023, Jack proposed to me. It was my birthday, and he surprised me when I came back home with the candle night dinner. It was a dream come true. He had also brought both our families secretly, and they were all there to congratulate me. He had done all of this just to make me happy. I knew then that I was marrying the right man. We then started to plan for our wedding and agreed that we would get married in February of this year. In December 2023 last year, I received a Facebook request from a familiar name. I clicked on it to see that it was my dad, which was quite unbelievable. I didn't bother accepting his request because I didn't understand why he wanted to be friends with me on social media when he was not even a part of my life. My dad then sent me a message request, and in the message he had written how he missed me and wanted to talk to me. I ignored them because I wanted nothing to do with him. Then I received a message on my phone from an unknown number, and it was my dad. He wrote me a message saying how he badly wanted to see me and realized what a huge mistake he had made for abandoning me. I showed the message to Jack, and he, like me, agreed that there was no way that my dad was really sorry out of nowhere after all these years. However, he told me that I could hear him out if I wanted. Jack assured me that he would come with me just in case my dad tried to yell at me. I agreed and replied back to my dad. He wanted to meet me, so we set up a meeting. I was really nervous to meet my dad, but I was glad that Jack was there for me. My dad was surprised to see Jack with me, but then wasn't rude to him outright. We made small talk here and there, and Then my dad eventually asked me about the ring on my finger and if I was married to Jack. I nervously told him that we were engaged and would be getting married in 2 months. My dad's face lit up. He told me that it was perfect timing for us, that he had reached out to me since he could now walk me down the aisle. I almost gagged when I heard that and turned to look at Jack, who understood exactly how I was feeling. Jack politely told my dad that this was something that I needed to decide all on my own, and I could not just forget years of abandonment all in a jiffy. My dad blew up hearing this. He started to scream at Jack that he had no right to come between a father and his daughter, and that I should not influence my decision. Watching Jack get disrespected really triggered something in me. All those years of being abandoned by him and resenting him came boiling out. I yelled back at him that he had no right to call himself my father when he had signed off his custody rights to my mother and did nothing except pay child support. He had driven me back to my house and shouted at my mother since I had shown up at his house. My dad tried to defend himself by saying how my mother was not easy to live with and that he was just shocked to see a child standing on his porch. He tried to justify how he was still drunk and regretted the way he behaved in front of me. I asked him then why he hadn't ever tried to contact me for all those years I lived in the same town as him, but he had no reply. I tried to remind him that I had done something in my life all on my own, and Jack was my partner who understood and loved me for who I was, so he had no right to ever raise his voice on me. Dad tried to say how Jack doesn't really understand and that this was a private matter between him, which just made me laugh. I reminded him that he was nothing but a sperm donor to me, and I wanted nothing to do with him. He begged me to forgive him, but I walked out with Jack. I did apologize to Jack for how my dad behaved with him, because he seemed really shaken up with everything. Later, my dad sent me several messages saying how I didn't have the whole picture and suggested that we meet privately. I mute his chat, so I didn't have to see his messages anymore. I did tell my mother and grandparents about meeting my dad, since they had no idea. They were really shocked and a bit pissed that I had even given this a thought. In the end, we all agreed that we would continue to live our lives as usual and stay away from him. In February, Jack and I had our magical wedding. All our families attended and my grandfather walked me down the aisle. My grandfather was crying throughout the wedding and kept saying how proud he was of me. My mother and grandmother also kept giving me hugs as they could not believe how far I had come in life. Jack and I danced with our families throughout the night and everyone had a good time. Then we went on our honeymoon for 2 weeks and it was good for us to take a good long break from our work. However, when I returned, I noticed that there were at least 50 messages from my dad. Since his chats had been muted, I didn't notice earlier. I went through the messages and they ranged from getting sympathy to being pissed that I got married in private and did not invite him. He kept saying how I should have contacted him and how he deserved to be there for me. I guess the word must have gotten around to him since everyone knows everyone in my old town, and my dad found out that grandfather had walked me down the aisle and was pissed. When I read his messages, I guess he must have noticed that it was all read, so he called me immediately. I picked up the phone and he started to tell me how I had betrayed him and that he never thought the day would come when I would treat him this way. I really tried to patiently explain to him yet again that it was not betrayal when he was not my father to begin with. My dad then started to say how he had saved up $75,000 for my wedding and was going to give it to me. I scoffed upon hearing this because I thought that there was no way that this was true. Then my dad continued to say that he was ready to give me the money, but all I had to do was get married again, even if it was a court wedding, and invite him so he could be there for me. He told me how it was his dream to watch his baby girl get married, and even if I was already married, he would compromise as long as I agreed to his terms. I don't know what he was thinking, or if he was even right in the head, but I straight up told him that this was ridiculous and I didn't want his money, which made him pissed. He started yelling at me that I was just a spoiled brat and that I was cruelly punishing him. He said other things as well, but I told him that I was done hearing him out as my patience was wearing thin. Since then, he has kept texting me about how I broke his heart and that getting married again just for him wasn't even a big deal. I don't understand what obsession he has about seeing me get married again, and I honestly do not understand. AITA for refusing to get married again, even though my dad wants to pay me $75,000? Update 1. Okay, I've heard everyone out. There are so many comments under my posts that it has taken me a while to get through them. First of all, a lot of you have concerns that my dad is probably lying again, which might be true. Also, since I find it extremely hard to believe he has $75,000 and just wants to give it to me without any strings attached. I do agree that his behavior seems extremely suspicious. A lot of you have theories that he is dying and maybe needs an organ transplant, which is really scaring me because no way would I agree to donate anything to him. I feel like I need to confirm with him to get closure and give him closure as well, since there is definitely something fishy going on and I want to get to the bottom of it. Secondly, a lot of you are asking about what happened to my dad's other child. Well, I have no idea, but unlike my mother, that woman wanted nothing to do with my dad except get child support from him. It was a one-night stand, so they wanted nothing to do with each other. I have no idea if the other child has ever reached out to him, nor do I care. It's my dad's decision, and it's his life. He already ruined my life, so I doubt he would do any better with his other child. Update 2. Wow, well, I finally have an update, and some of you won't like it. I decided to meet my dad this weekend and sort things out once and for all. He was more than happy to meet me. This time I didn't take Jack with me as I wanted to see him on my own and confront him about everything. We met at a cafe where I told Dad that I knew something was up with him, with the way he's been acting, because there was no way that he just woke up and regretted doing all those things to me years ago. My dad looked down, feeling ashamed, and then started to say how I was right. He told me that last year he was working one day when he suddenly got a splitting headache and fell down on the ground. He injured himself gravely and was taken to the hospital. This is when doctors discovered the tumor in my dad's brain. I won't get into the medical details, but they pretty much informed my dad that he didn't have a long time to live, as the tumor was in a location that was inoperable. Since my dad has been injured at work, he got a hefty settlement because the company didn't want any legal troubles, but they let him go after this. Since then, he had realized all those opportunities he had lost and everyone he had pushed away in his life. He told me how his biggest regret was not being there for me. His voice broke as he recounted how he had a difficult childhood where his dad would abuse him a lot, and he grew up thinking that is how fathers behave. When he met my mom, for once he thought he could be happy and they got married. However, with his work pressure and bills piling up, he slowly started to turn into his father and resorted to drinking and smoking. He said how he knew what a monster he was turning into but just could not stop himself and gave no excuses. He told me the reason he had given up custody rights was because he didn't want to ever treat me the way his father had. He told me that he was afraid of all the rage inside him, and no matter how much he tried, he just could not move past it. The day he saw me at his doorstep, he wanted to break down and hug me, but he thought if he allowed me back into his life, then I would start to have expectations from him, and he knew he would only disappoint me. He talked about how he had never started a family of his own or married anyone and lived like a hermit because he didn't want to bring any pain to anyone else. He told me that he deserved all the hate and resentment I had for him, but the only reason he was begging me to let him be a part of my life was because he had a few months left and wanted to spend his days with me. He said he regretted how he could not be a good father and wanted to do everything he possibly could for me. At this point, I hate to admit it, but I was crying. I know a lot of you will say that my dad was just giving excuses, but he was still my father, and this was the first time he had ever opened up to me so honestly and laid everything out. I told him that while I understood his reasons, I still could not just allow him to waltz into my life as he pleased. I told him that he might have craved to walk me down the aisle during my wedding, but I spent my whole life wanting to see him, be there for me during my birthday, parties, sport events, or graduation, but he was never there. Dad nodded his head and told me that he knew this was all his fault and started to say that regardless of my decision, he had already set up a will and the $75,000 he had talked about, his house and his car, would be going to me. He told me that he was sorry for everything and he wished he could go back when he was in his 20s and slap himself for being such a fool. He told me that I should never become someone like him, and that if I ever do have children, I should be kind-hearted like my mother. He then took out pictures that he had taken of my mother while she was pregnant with me. He had taken pictures of her almost every month, and if my parents' marriage was not a failure, this all would have looked like a movie. He sat with me and told me the story behind each of the pictures and what my mother was doing at that time. I could hear the pain and hurt in his voice as he remembered everything. Seeing those pictures just broke my heart again because my parents looked so young and so happy. He told me to take the pictures with me since they rightfully belonged to me. As if this wasn't enough, he then took out an old box, and this is when I was shocked to see all my letters inside. This man had literally saved each and every letter I had ever written and asked my grandfather to mail it to him. I cried seeing my childish handwriting and the way I had written about missing him and begging him to come back. My dad got teary-eyed also and told me that he read all the letters and it only made him drink more because he knew he didn't deserve the love I had for him. He informed me that he would not contact me ever again until I was ready to talk to him, but urged me to get in touch with him before it was too late for him. When we were leaving the cafe, I don't know what came over me, but I hugged him. He was taken aback, but then warmly hugged me back. Since then, I feel like I finally got all the answers in my life. All those answers I chased for as a child have been given to me now. I now understood why my dad did not want to have a relationship with me, and although his past does not excuse his behavior or his responsibility as a father, I am glad that he stayed away from me because he knew he didn't want to treat me like his dad treated him. I am glad that I grew up with warm, loving people like my mother and grandparents who made my life so much easier. I feel like my 12-year-old self can finally rest knowing that it was not my fault for what my dad did. Update 3. Thank you everyone for all your replies and DMs after my update last week about my dad. I feel seen and heard. After reading some of the messages where others have gone through situations like this, I have talked to my mother and she does agree with his version of the events, so I guess my dad wasn't lying. My mother was aware of my dad's side of the family and how they treated him throughout his childhood, which is why I was never introduced to his parents. I told my mother how Dad had saved my letters and her pregnancy pictures, and she was surprised as well. She says she will have my back if I do decide to talk to my dad, even though she wants nothing to do with him. She understands that he means well now and might have genuine regrets during the last months of his life. To be honest, I have not fully decided yet whether I should continue my relationship with my father or not, but I do feel bad for the guy. Jack agrees with me and has encouraged me to take baby steps, which is exactly what I will be doing. I will take my relationship with my dad one meeting at a time and see how things go from there. I will also be going to therapy to deal with my own issues, as several of you have suggested. You are right, I don't want to be like my dad and carry around all the hate and resentment in my heart. I will do better and take care of myself. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.